Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Nature as Our Teacher, our first ever launch event for From the Ground Up. We will be sharing wonderful conversations today with some of the contributors from the spring 2024 issue of From the Ground Up. And I'm going to turn this program over to Liz Thompson.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And I want to just introduce From the Ground Up, starting with wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities, which is the umbrella under which From the Ground Up lives. And this is an organization, a collaborative conservation partnership that has been in place for over 20 years. And its first publication was in 2005, Wildlands and Woodlands, and last year published Wildlands in New England. So a long collaboration. Last year in the fall, we also launched From the Ground Up, which is a quarterly online publication that is designed to promote the integrated conservation approach that wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities is advancing. So the journal invites conversations about conservation, climate, and communities in New England. Our first issue was in November of last year, and we are now proudly launching our third issue, spring of this year, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, From the Ground Up. So the image that you see this is the cover. When you open the journal, this is what you see. Beautiful image from Susan Bull Riley, which is in our backgrounds as well, artist Susan Bull Riley. The publication features artists, poets, photographers, writers, and writers of all kinds. So we invite writing that is essays, poetry, personal writing, and very, very deeply scientific writing as well. So we'll have samples from all of that today. Our program for today is as follows. We are going to be introducing From the Ground Up. We'll hear from Verandah Porche, a poet who contributed to this issue. We will hear from four authors on a very important new report, Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. We will hear from Judy Dow, a writer and artist. And then finally, we will hear your thoughts and questions, and we'll be ending at about 10:40 to take your questions. So I just wanted to make sure that you can see a full image of Susan Bull Riley's beautiful, beautiful painting of bloodroot, which is symbolic, emblematic of springtime. And this is a plant that comes from the ground up early in spring. It's one of the first spring wildflowers. And by now, the fruits are developing and the seeds are spreading, and we are spreading the seeds of conservation through From the Ground Up. I want to also mention a few pieces that are in this issue that we will not be hearing directly about today, but just another little bit of sampler. Agroecology as Faith by Conrad Bispo, with beautiful artwork by Linda Mirabile. This is a piece that's very interesting about the ecology of agriculture, long, interesting, very well-researched piece. I encourage you to read it. Conrad Bispo writes about wildlands and wildlife, whose values count. We have an interview with Heather Furman of the Nature Conservancy, Give Nature an Inch. We have an interview with Doug Tallamy, Nature's Best Hope. But we're going to now turn it over to Verandah. This is a piece of art. That was by Kathleen Kolb that accompanies Verandah's poem, Morning Work on the Landing. So Verandah, Apologies. Yeah, just a second. Just a second. Let me just say a little bit about you, Veranda.
Oh, just a
And
little will do.
okay, yeah, Verandah Porche is a poet who is been active in works as a poet in residence, performer, and writing partner based in rural Vermont in a commune. She has published several books and read on National Public Radio, in the State House, and other places. So I will turn it over to you, Veranda.
Okay, could you put the painting back up? Could you
Yes.
display the painting as well, please?
There you go.
Okay. So yes, I'm Verandah Porche, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the source of this painting by Kathleen Kolb. And for many years, Kathleen and I worked together as staff at the Governor's Institute on the Arts. And after painter Kathleen left there to focus on her own work, she came back and showed a collection of paintings to the students. And among the light-bathed paintings was a series of paintings about people working in the forest. And as soon as I saw them, I felt these paintings needed a voice. And so Kathleen and I concocted this project called Shedding Light on the Working Forest, which culminated in a traveling exhibition that went all over New England and also as far away as Ohio, where they still have working forests. And we produced a catalog that we still have. And so Kathleen shadowed the workers in the forest, truckers, loggers, sawmill operators, foresters, and very quietly photographed their work and came back to her studio and painted them. And she gave prints of these paintings to all of the people who were involved, and they loved them. So for me, I could follow her lead, and she called up each one of the worker participants and said, my poet friend wants to come and talk to you, which was really kind of hilarious because nobody wants to talk to a poet. Anyhow, people loved her paintings, and what I said to them was, you're the ambassador. Without your knowledge that I wrote down and we edited together, it was, here's a guy with a machine and another guy with a machine. Anyway, the two people you see in this painting are Larry Sherman on the right and his son on the left. And I'm going to just read you, before I read my poem, just an excerpt from the narrative that Larry Sherman spoke to me. He said, this is about hunting. He said, when I was farming, I used to get up at midnight, do chores, come in, eat breakfast, and head for the top of the mountain. Don't know as I do that today. I don't have the drive for it. I didn't think I'd ever change. I could probably show you 40 some odd guns here. Haven't shot nothing in probably 14 years now. Bullets are expensive. It's going to have to be a good one before I pull the trigger. I used to kill for hunting. Very few big bucks now. There are a lot of trees to hide behind too. Trees still standing. When you're in the woods all the time and then go into the woods for a vacation, it takes the fun away from it, I guess. You're looking at the trees a different way. Oh, there's a nice money tree. There goes a buck into the woods. So that's Larry talking. You'll notice that here's Larry's son next to him. His son died young after that painting was done. And what you probably can't see is that there's a bottle of Mountain Dew on the truck bed. Kathleen noticed that with her great eye, but that's right. Thank you so much. And somehow the fact that they didn't fling that bottle of Mountain Dew into the forest seemed deeply significant to Kathleen and still to me. So here is my poem that does incorporate a little bit of Larry's voice. Morning work on the landing. West Hill, Lincoln. Dawn, the chickadees kick in. Father and son are glad to be done with farming for nothing, 24/7 starving to death, and zero ain't so bad when you're dressed for it. The grapple holds aloft a log longer than the man who felled it, snow on the bark. The loader will never tuck this one in the truck bed, and the son won't snug it with his bar. Gazing back, the father grins. This painting is right on the money. The red hat, the blue cab, the shadow they stand in between fell and grapple. Everyone's life is a book, he adds. What leaves his son won't turn, let's overlook. Like this valley or the empty Mountain Dew not littering the forest floor. So that's my poem. My husband died during the time that we were working on this project, and it was really the loggers who comforted me. There was another logger who said in a very different context this. He said about felling a tree, and you want a good ending when that tree hits the ground. You create a bed for it. And the people that Kathleen and I worked with, these loggers and truckers and foresters who were very skeptical of our project at the very first, really became a support system for both of us. The pride that they took in their work, their know-how, and also their erasure from every possible conversation about the working forest and about nature. Their absence from that conversation felt very poignant to me, and I hope and believe that that's changing. So that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Verandah. That was wonderful. And what a gift to have the story behind the poem, the story behind the painting, and to know about what it all has meant to you in the process. Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from a group of authors on a very important new publication, Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. This is if you can barely see at the bottom, but there are actually 7 authors of this publication. 3 of them are here today, and I will let one of them introduce the original publication from which this grew. So we're going to start with David Foster. David is an ecologist, director emeritus of Harvard Forest, president emeritus of the Highstead Foundation. He co-founded the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities Initiative in 2010 and was lead writer of Wildlands in New England, Past, Present, and Future in 2023, just last year. David has written many books and articles, but among his books are Thoreau's Country, Forest in Time, Hemlock, a forest giant on the edge, and A Meeting of Land and Sea, a beautiful book about Martha's Vineyard. Following David, we will have Caitlin Littlefield, who will talk about the report and the findings. Caitlin is a senior scientist at Conservation Science Partners, She's broadly trained research ecologist and works at the intersection of forest ecology, conservation biology, and climate adaptation science. She works with land managers and planners across the country, from the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and National Park Service, as well as a number of state agencies. Caitlin taught at the UVM Forestry Program, has conducted research at the University of Montana, and received her doctorate from the University of Washington and a master's from the University of Vermont. She also works on carbon projects, and which takes her all over the country. She lives in Richmond, Vermont, where she does restoration work. Brian Donahue then will speak, and he is the Professor Emeritus of American Environmental Studies at Brandeis and a farm and forest policy consultant. He holds a PhD from the Brandeis Program in History. He co-founded and for 12 years directed For Land's Sake, a nonprofit community farm in Weston, Massachusetts. Brian is the author of Reclaiming the Commons, Community Farms and Forests in a New England Town, and The Great Meadow, Farmers in the Land in Colonial Concord. And he is a co-author of Wildlands and Woodlands and a New England Food Vision. So I am going to now turn it in we have another guest, which whom David will introduce. So I will now turn it over to you, David, and let me know if you would like to keep this slide up for a minute or if I should take it down. Thank you.
Why don't you leave it up for a minute, Liz, while I introduce this original version of The Illusion of Preservation. So this paper and this project started in the 1990s in a lecture that I used to give in my forest ecology class at Harvard. In that lecture, I noted that an awful lot of people who live in affluent societies would rather not harvest their forests and would rather not see woods within their township harvested extensively. And so in my lecture, I would look at that, examine the distribution of harvesting practices and sourcing of wood, and I made the argument that actually it might be much better for the global environment if people who consume a tremendous amount of wood would produce as much of it as possible from their own backyard, from their own surroundings, and so on. And I argued that that would be much more sustainable because in that affluent society, the environmental oversight might be greater than some of the very distant places where the wood was being produced. Well, in giving that lecture over the years, one day, an undergraduate student who had been very actively engaged in the class and contributing lots of ideas to our discussions, a woman by the name of Mary Burlick, came up and proposed that she would undertake an examination of that idea and how it might play out as part of her senior thesis work. Well, I, of course, was incredibly interested in seeing more made of that idea and to see it examined in detail. But I also realized that neither Mary or I had the background in harvesting, wood production, sourcing of wood, and so on that was needed. And so I suggested that we bring Dave Kittredge, professor at the University of Massachusetts, into this work. Mary readily agreed. Mary worked closely with Dave and then reached out all across the region and actually across the United States to find people who were experts in different aspects of the many different themes that come into thinking about where we produce our wood from and how we go about it. One of the really interesting aspects of the development of the paper was that Mary had a background which included having lived in the Netherlands. And so she brought an interesting twist to our paper because she made the suggestion that we'd be even better off if those people who consume a tremendous amount of wood in these affluent societies would actually reduce their demand, their reduction of natural resources, including wood, by recycling it and doing other kinds of things. So we produced this paper. I had major questions about it. One, Would it be possible to find the infrastructure and people to undertake this kind of harvesting in a state like Massachusetts, which was the focus of this original paper? 2, of course, was, would people pay any attention to this argument for reducing wood? Now, as we were talking about producing more wood from Massachusetts, we were also talking about the potential of setting aside wildlands and wilderness areas in southern New England. And so these 2 ideas came together and eventually led to the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative, which has become Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities. Well, after we published the most recent Beyond Illusion paper, I reached back out to see if I could locate Mary Burlick, and I did. She's an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard University, where she studies the linkage between the environment and human health. And I'm very pleased to introduce her here to share a few of her thoughts about re-engaging in this project some 20 years later.
Thank you, David. First of all, I want to commend the 7 authors of this report for taking a modern and holistic look at the paradox of wood consumption and environmental preservation, propelled by more advanced science in the climate crisis. And I also want to share on a very personal note that working on the illusion of preservation with David Foster and David Kittredge as a college student and then as a graduate was a truly transformative experience for me. That experience of researching and writing about our interdependence with the natural world and envisioning a more sustainable and healthy future is what guided me towards a career focused on the health effects of climate change. And nowadays, I spend a lot of my time studying the health effects of climate change and air pollution, including wildfire smoke. And I work across a lot of different disciplines, including forest scientists. And as a physician, I'm also grappling with questions about the full environmental and climate impact of healthcare delivery, just as this new report rigorously delves into the full impact of our wood consumption and makes practical recommendations. And one thing that comes through from this report, and that will inspire me as I advocate for a One Health approach to the climate crisis, is the emphasis of the value of nature and forests. Wildlands and woodlands are a source of resilience that we need now more than ever. And I am thrilled that this expert group has put forward an achievable vision to help meet climate and biodiversity goals. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mary. Back to you, Liz.
And now we'll turn it over to Caitlin Littlefield, who will speak about the report Beyond the Illusion of Preservation.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, David, for that background. And Mary, it is such a pleasure to even virtually connect with you here and see how some of the threads from your past great work of the original illusion of preservation is still resonant, perhaps in your work today. So I do want to talk a little bit about some of the motivation for and the findings for us revisiting that work, because in many ways, the argument hasn't necessarily changed. There still is a compelling argument to be made for localizing the production of our wood products, a global environmental argument to do so. So then why did we revisit this work? I'd say that a primary motivation for revisiting this work and extending it beyond Massachusetts really is encapsulated in this mounting pressure across the region to reduce harvesting, especially on our public lands, to maximize ecological values and especially the capacity of forests to store carbon. And against this just unprecedented climate change that we're experiencing globally now, I do find it so heartening that there's this growing societal recognition of just how magical photosynthesis and carbon fixation are, and just how crucial our forests are as a natural climate solution for helping us mitigate the oncoming effects of climate change and for stemming the breathtaking rates of biodiversity loss and decline that we're witnessing. And so we do wholeheartedly, as a group of authors, support expanding wildlands, which yield irreplaceable benefits to nature, to society, and yet right now cover only 4% of New England. But to the point in Mary's original piece, and then the piece that we've expanded upon in this year, that strategy by itself is going to fail to provide the full suite of benefits that we seek from our forests here in New England and beyond. So if we simply reduce harvesting in New England while maintaining our super high levels of consumption, we're simply shifting that wood production elsewhere, including, to David's point, to parts of the globe where there may be greater amounts of intact forests, biodiversity, and weaker environmental oversight than we have the capacity to exact here in New England. And so it's because of that leakage, that shifting of production elsewhere, that reduced cutting here at home in our own backyard will do little to decrease carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere and protect biodiversity. It will simply extend that illusion of preservation. So unless that very real need to expand and create more wildlands is matched by the equally real need for sustainable harvesting to address our wood product demands, and crucially, reducing our consumption period, then we're not really getting at the heart of the matter. Therein lies the illusion. So addressing that illusion requires a comprehensive and integrated approach that can logically begin with wild places and wildlands, but for as long as we use wood products, has to also include the responsible, productive use of woodlands. And so in our publication that we expanded beyond Massachusetts, as I mentioned, we first sought to quantify the gap between production and consumption in New England states. And I won't show any figures now here, but as included in our glossy publication, which was on which Liz showed before. I don't know if anybody can, if it's visible here on Zoom, but also in the From the Ground Up recap of that article. What we did find is that New England as a whole produces about close to 3/4 of the wood product that's consumed therein, which sounds pretty promising, but there are some really stark disparities within the region as well. So all told, we generate about 70% of New England's production, wood production from Maine, while about 70% of the consumption occurs in southern New England. So of course, southern New England is where most of the region's population resides, and it has less forest. But even if Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts can't produce all the woods consumed therein, those states do have the capacity to do far more in terms of increasing production and reducing consumption. And that's particularly true in addressing our lumber deficit, because as a region, we produce about 60% of the lumber that is consumed here, and are otherwise importing it from elsewhere. So we set forth a pretty ambitious vision by 2060 that would not only remedy these production and consumption imbalances, but also dramatically increase the protection of our forests and propel us towards meeting some of those urgent climate and biodiversity goals. So first and foremost, our first step is that we need to permanently protect New England forests in a mosaic of passively managed wildlands, which is at least 10% of the landscape, as well as actively sustainably managed woodlands, combining to at least 70% of all New England. We must reduce our consumption. And we envision doing so with a reduction of at least 25%, while also urgently meeting our urgent housing needs and reorienting consumption to more durable products. We also are advocating for expanding ecological forestry. And if we were to sustainably and ecologically manage 20 million acres across the region, across all of New England, including our corporate forests and roughly 50% of family, nonprofit, and public forests, for example, we could meet our needs as a region. So collectively, these steps, protecting forests, reducing consumption, and expanding ecological forestry, really illustrate the sheer scale that we require to move beyond the illusion of preservation. And to be clear, this isn't simply a matter of ramping up production to erase that imbalance, but instead it's moving towards a holistic vision that's deliberate and that really safeguards the ecological, economic, and social values of New England's forests while sustainably meeting our resource needs. And I will say, as part of this work and as featured in From the Ground Up, what we've done is draw upon some reflections from 4 different individuals: Mike Snyder, formerly the Commissioner for Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation; Lincoln Fish, a consulting forester; Julie Renat Evans, Program Director at the Northern Forest Center; and Dave Publicover, formerly of the Appalachian Mountain Club. And they each articulate a recognition for both wild places and for managed places, and acknowledge that balance that we need if we are to bring our unchecked consumption into balance with how much we are also producing as a region while advancing protection. And so certainly these voices don't represent the extreme ends of any perspective, but I think they are really emblematic of that common ground that we must all find and that balance that we must find in terms of needing passively managed wildlands and actively ecologically managed woodlands. And we desperately need to protect both of them. And so we're really excited to launch this regional conversation to do so. I'll hand it over to Brian.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And before we hear from Brian, let me just remind people, if you would, to put your questions and comments in the Q&A, and we will take some time at the end. After Brian speaks, we'll hear from Judy Dow, and then we will have some time for questions and answers. So Brian, go ahead.
Sure, glad to. And someone's got to turn my video back on because I cannot do it. So return me off. Well, I will just speak, and the illusion of preservation. Well, we want to acknowledge that it's a provocative title and a very striking title, and we're sort of stuck with it because David used it in that original lecture he was talking about, and it really caught people's attention. But we don't mean to imply, as Caitlin said, there we go. We don't mean to imply that we're against preservation. Preservation is very important. We're for it. We've called for at least 10% of New England to be in passively managed, permanently protected wildlands. We're very passionate about that side of this. It becomes an illusion, as we've all been saying this morning, only if we concentrate on it to the exclusion of thinking about where our wood comes from and just allow that to stay out of sight and out of mind. We also, in a little piece we put in the from the ground up, Caitlin and David and I pointed out that there's a flip side to the illusion of preservation, which we called the compulsion of management, which is the urge to try to improve on every piece of forest, to think that we need to make every piece of forest we find better somehow for one reason or another. And that is equally a problem if you leave no room for wildlands. The problem is that most people would agree with that, I think, who are involved in the forest conservation in theory, but in practice it's extremely difficult to pull off the kind of blending we're talking about in a market economy. Things inevitably seem to get driven to one extreme or the other. To go in and cut more lightly makes you and preserve ecological values while you're harvesting makes you less profitable, makes you less economical. So that's really the nub of the problem in our view. We argue for, as Caitlin said, this widespread ecological forestry that promotes environmental values while harvesting, long rotations, mature forests mostly, all great stuff, lots of wild reserves alongside that. But somebody's got to pay for the additional costs of managing in that way. So we put forth just very briefly the idea that could be consumers paying more. That could be society as a whole by making payments to landowners to manage in this more cautious kind of way, for instance, through carbon payments or ecosystem service payments. Or it could be landowners themselves. The forest could be owned by folks who don't necessarily want to maximize their profit, even though they'd like to get some economic return out of the forest. So we think if we can come up with ways of putting all three of those together, we're going to have the kind of a forest system that we want to have. So the bottom line there is that we have to move beyond the biggest illusion of all, which is the market knows what's best for us. If we stick with that, we're going to stay in the kind of polarized situation we're in, where we have short rotation plantation forestry on the one hand, and a bunch of us ecological folks desperately trying to preserve a few scraps of wild places on the other. So that's something we're going to explore further in upcoming issues of From the Ground Up. And now, just to close, I would like to also, Caitlin mentioned some of the reflections we had, and one of them that really struck me, especially, putting it in along with Verandah's poem and Kathleen's painting. So much of this is about generations and the passage of time. And we have a great reflection and generations of both people and trees alongside one another. We have a really neat reflection among the four by Lincoln Fish, who's a consulting forester. And he sent some photographs along with it. And this is a very striking one of his daughter, Jess, as a little girl hugging an oak tree, it's kind of thing we're used to seeing. And further down in the articles, he talks about different forest stands he's managed for different people over a 40, 50-year career. We come to this, which is same girl, but now grown up to be a college student, hugging the same tree. But it has these little blue marks on it. It's going to be harvested. It's part of the way they're going to pay for her college tuition. So that's a nice kind of parallel story. There's Lincoln himself. After some firewood cutting, I know that look very well. And there's some young oak seedlings in the openings created by harvesting the big oaks. So I'm going to stop there. Turn it back to Liz.
Thank you very much, Brian. That was great. How great to hear from all of you, and especially Mary, to have you here and to share your reflections on this important piece of work that you began those years ago as a student. We're now going to turn it over to Judy Dow. I would like to introduce Judy Dow. Judy is of Abenaki and French-Canadian descent. She is the executive director of Gadakana, which is an educational organization that provides resources to Native American women and their families. She has an education career spanning more than 3 decades. She's an environmentalist, consultant, author, basket maker, conducting classes and workshops for students of all ages. She was the 2004 recipient of the Governor's Heritage Award for Outstanding Educator and the Arthur Williams 2022 Award for Meritorious Service to the Arts. So Judy, this is one of Judy's works of art that you can see that's hanging in a forest. Judy has written a lovely piece called The White Monsters, and I will let Judy speak now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. When my first grandchild was born, I would sit rocking her in the same chair I had rocked my children. I would tell her about the many stories of my life and our travels. Wide-eyed, she'd sit there and listen to story after story of Pepe, my grandfather, living in Moccasin Village in Burlington, and the many journeys in our family's life as we traveled from Burlington to South Arrow seasonally. As she grew and my second grandchild arrived, I began to realize I needed to record these stories. Thanks to Guilford Sound in Guilford, Vermont, I received a scholarship to record 11 of the stories. There is no word for time in the Abenaki language, so most stories are told in the present tense and bounce back and forth through time. Time is now. Today, I'd like to read part of one of those stories to you. The White Monsters. Pepe would tell me stories as we walked through the riparian forest, picking a few fiddleheads here and a few there until we had a pailful. It was important not to pick all we wanted in one place. Picking all the heads on one bulb would kill the bulb, Pepe explained. So we walked all day long, picking here and there. The heads we left behind would provide a beautiful spray of ostrich fern that would eventually grow to cover the worn path we walked on in early spring. As we slowly walked back to the house, I would tell Pepe how much I love spending time in the Intervale. Yes, he would tell me, it's a great place to visit and to get your food. Before I was born, Pepe would hunt for muskrat in the spring. He and my father would tan hides in their backyard and sell them for 75 cents a piece. Muskrats live in the wetlands of the Intervale, making little push-ups for dens to protect their young from predators. When visiting Pepe during this time, it was not uncommon to see many hides stretched out drying in his backyard. People wanted the hides for their warm coats. Sometimes in the spring, we'd fish for shad. When the shad trees were in bloom in the uplands where I live, the shad are spawning in the lowlands where Pepe lives. Pepe would go to the edge of the river where his two-ended boat was tied up, and we would fish for shad. The pesky little shad flies were out too. They would land on every part of my body until I shooed them away. Pepe would say, "Never mind them. They won't hurt you. They're food for the fish." The cycle is confused now because of climate change. The shad flies are not always there in time for the shad run. My favorite berries were shad berries. We picked baskets full of these little berries to bring them to Pepe because they didn't grow in the interval, and Pepe just loved them. As we floated downriver in the boat that Pepe's brother had made, I looked up at the trees stretched over the river, and I dreamed of living in the interval. I never wanted to leave there. It was so beautiful. In the summer, we made trips to the interval, picking raspberries, blackberries, and many different kinds of plants for food and medicines. We also fished for bass and perch and occasionally caught an eel. Pepe had stories for them all. I can hear him singing, "Little fishies in the lake, come and bite upon my bait." The eels were sweet and prized by the elders living down the road. So Pepe nailed their heads to the trees, cut around their throats, and pulled their skins off. He then had us deliver the eels to the old people living in Moccasin Village. I later found out the eels were high nutritional value, something I'm sure Pepe knew all the time, which is exactly why the old elders got the eels. One beautiful winter day, when we were snowshoeing through the interval, I blurted out, "Pepe, I love the interval. I want to live here when I grow up." "You can't live in the interval," he said. "Why?" I asked. He then told me, well, that not always, but sometimes the white monsters come and destroy everything in the interval. "The white monsters?" I gasped. He said the interval was the place that we had to share with the white monsters. It was their home too. The white monsters are what helps to make the interval so special, Pepe said. Slowly we walked back to the house and he told me the story of the white monsters. I'm sure you have an idea as to who the white monsters really are, but I'll leave you with this cliffhanger so as not to spoil the ending for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was wonderful. So great to hear from you and to hear the story. And I am on the edge of my seat. I want to acknowledge two people that you haven't, that are here today who also contribute to From the Ground Up. Alex Redfield is a member of the editorial board and writes on policy issues, and Renee Cummings supports the work in many ways, including this event. I will now remind you to put more questions in the Q&A, and I will turn it over to Marissa Latshaw to manage the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, everyone. Yes, if everyone, if all the panelists can put their cameras back on, that way we can move through these questions and pose them to different folks. So one question we have here, I'm going to pose it, start it with Caitlin, and feel free, Caitlin, then to bounce it to David and Brian if you would like them to fill in as well. But the question here is, how can we bring consumption and production into alignment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really what we strove to answer in our publication, Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. And the scenario that we set forth is one of many, but as I described, we are aiming to advance forest protection, reduction of consumption, as well as expansion of ecological forestry, and have set some reasonable but also rigorous targets for doing so. I do think that bringing that production and consumption into balance, one of the perhaps the most exciting and also trickiest parts of that is going to be the reduction in consumption piece. There are some astonishing numbers around. For example, in 1975, the average square footage of your average single family house in New England was about 1,600 square feet, and we're now at 2,800 square feet. So we are just on this trajectory of amplified consumption that is not only resulting in more and more use of our natural products as well, natural resources, as well as fossil fuel-based resources as well. But I think it's also the geography of our consumption also is driving us all further apart and further from the land as well. And so I do think that not only as we all individually reduce our consumption, but we rethink how our communities are structured and how we can live in a more communal way and in relationship with one another and the land and the forest. That's going to be, again, one of the toughest nuts to crack with this vision that we set forth, but will yield, I think, innumerable benefits and enable us to even more readily achieve that balance of production and consumption. But happy to have Brian or David weigh in there on anything.
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. I worked on that piece of our paper. So a couple things about that. I think a lot of people probably listening would react, sure, you know, great idea. Everyone says we should reduce consumption, but it's never actually going to happen. How are people ever going to choose to do that? Well, as a matter of fact, US consumption of paper has been declining for the last 20 years as this kind of thing we're doing now come to be more, you know, digital, remote kind of communications are replacing paper. The only place, and newsprint, of course, has collapsed. So the only place paper use is really going up is in packaging. So that's something we have to tackle. But we think increased recycling of paper and reducing consumption while we reduce other things like plastics at the same time is really quite doable within that context. And on housing, you know, if we were addressing our affordable housing needs, that would in and of itself, that's factored into the calculations we made about how wood consumption, lumber consumption could be reduced. That would mean smaller average house sizes if we were building that kind of housing. So, you know, we tried to base those estimates of reduced consumption on plausible trends, population growth trends, housing needs, and so forth that are out there, not just on kind of wishful thinking.
And I'll just add one last note to that. Thank you, Brian, for adding in those nuances around the actual numbers and how we're kind of on track. This kind of gets at one of the other questions too around, we're talking about here reduced consumption of wood products, but really we need reduced consumption across the board, to Brian's point. And the scenario that we lay forth can accommodate the use of wood as a substitute for more carbon intensive materials, whether that's polystyrene, plastic, steel in our construction. And so certainly there is a lot of R&D going on and vibrancy and excitement around using engineered wood products, mass timber, et cetera. And so we do envision, and our scenario does not preclude the increased use of wood as an important, durable carbon storing material to displace more carbon intensive materials as well, especially as we meet our housing needs.
Great, thank you so much. This one I'm going to pose to David. How do we decide which forests to preserve as wildlands versus manage as woodlands for local products? Are there characteristics that help us identify them?
So other people will certainly want to weigh in on this. And in fact, Liz Thompson is involved very actively in an effort in Vermont. And now the WWF&C is trying to lead across New England to identify some of the priority areas for wildlands. I think the first thing to do is to decide what the purpose of the wildlands are in different areas. That is, what are the motivations for establishing wildlands, which vary. And so, for example, in our report on the wildlands of New England, we end up making the point that most wildlands are actually quite distant from people, which makes sense because a lot of these are remote and even kind of wilderness areas that were established in very distant parts of national forests. They also tend to be at high elevations and less accessible and less hospitable for people. We made the point that though that there should be wildlands that are accessible. And so there is actually a strong interest by many groups to establish these areas which are not actively managed and allowed to develop with natural processes alone in areas that are reachable by people. So that's one direction certainly to take. The other direction that I think Liz can talk much more about is the fact that we can prioritize different habitats that deserve to be wildlands because they're fragile, because they have rare and unusual species and rare and unusual complexes of vegetation. They also can expand the representation of areas of different types of vegetation that we have in wildlands. And then a third direction, of course, is to establish wildlands so that they are truly immense and large enough to support natural processes. And very few of our wildlands are of such size, and yet there are proposals for establishing big areas, especially up north in northern New England on former industrial lands and in other areas that are well suited for extensive areas because they support very few communities. They have very little development, and there are large tracts of land. And then I guess just finally to mention, of course, there's a big effort that's being started now in the state of Massachusetts to look at expanding existing wildlands. And so to look at joining existing places and to try to connect them in ways that forge good landscape linkages. So I don't know, Liz, if you'd like to say a little bit more about the work that you're doing with folks in Vermont and with Brian Hall, but that certainly is trying to prioritize.
I won't say anything more, David. You put it well, except to acknowledge, in fact, Brian Hall, who is a wonderful analyst, thinker, scientist, one of the authors of Beyond the Illusion of Preservation, and is making this work happen with some very sophisticated GIS analysis. So looking at the representation, looking at finding places that are in the valleys and the lowlands, in addition to all the mountain places that we have already protected as wildland.
I want to throw in one other thing here, which is that Caitlin and I, when we did the calculations, for the wood that we would need to meet our needs, we set those wildlands aside on paper, not specific areas, but we took 10% of New England, as Wildlands and Woodlands calls for, and took that out of the pool that could be managed. And in fact, when we did our calculations, there's room for 20% of New England to be in wildlands. So we really want to say these two things are not in conflict. They're only in conflict if people want to make them in conflict.
Great, thank you so much. A good, I think, follow-on to that is this idea of a working forest. Does this imply that there's something called a non-working forest? And if so, does that non-working forest have less value than a working forest? David, if you're smiling, like you might want to take.
Yes, where is Keith Ross when we need him? Almost every conversation that that term comes up in, Keith Ross, as well as other people, kind of exclaim and say, why? Are there lazy forests that are out there that aren't working hard enough? So the point being that every forest provides immense benefits, and to reduce a kind of working forest, which is, I suppose, trying to give kind of Puritan values to our forests and to hold them up as exalted because they're producing something like timber, is to ignore all the other wonderful benefits of forests, and whether they're producing water, or they're producing clean air, or they're producing and providing habitat and enjoyment to people. So we certainly very much stay away from the working forest nomenclature, but working lands in general is kind of well established as a term for farmlands and forest lands that produce stuff that we value more, perhaps, than we value the environmental and other benefits.
Right, and as Verandah said, maybe you want to say something again, Verandah, that people know in a different way than just appreciating them aesthetically or for their ecological values, which are, immense. But I think the term, as many of us use it, just implies that other kind of relationship between people. And actually working there. It's not that just the forest is working, it's that people are working in it.
Mhm. Yes, I mean, the people that we interviewed were also a vanishing group. But their intimacy with the forest, I mean, when I was listening to Judy, as I always love to do, the loggers, the foresters, the depth of respect and even tenderness that they had for the lands that they were stewarding was something sort of unknown, and the expertise that it required. I mean, they had great humor about many of them, about being adrenaline junkies, but the other side of that was that they had to be on and know what they were doing at all times. And one of the things that interested me was the response to our exhibition. For instance, the first place that we showed this group of paintings and drawings and narrative was at the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. And they had people who crossed the line into that museum who had never been in that museum or any museum. And they looked so carefully at all of the machines and all of the processes and felt for the first time that their skill set was visible and respected by somebody. And some of the other commentators talked about how they always thought noise in the woods was annoying, but they liked toilet paper, they liked their book collection, they liked their dining room table, and so, I mean, let alone their houses. And so by following our interests in sort of authenticity and underrepresentation, it really was in some small way a consciousness raising experience. We weren't the primary beneficiaries for once. Our communities, I felt, really had a kind of more open-hearted way of seeing what was going on around them.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Miranda.
much. Oh, go ahead, Caitlin.
Thanks, Marissa. Just one last quick comment. I do appreciate that, Miranda. Thank you. And I do want to go back to that, what David said around this sort of working lands, working forests, is sort of accepted nomenclature, even as that word does unfortunately imply that or sets up an unnecessary contrast around non-working forests. And I think the same could be said, and this is something we grappled with a little bit in our publication, around using terms like low-grade wood, low-value wood. And that does just reflect the market that we operate in, the capitalism that Brian alluded to, that we operate in. And I do, even as we do use these terms that are very widely accepted, I think we can't ignore the fact that words do get down deep into your subconscious, and we need to think about reframing things like especially low-grade, low-value wood, and for what it actually is, which is enormously, the values of which cannot necessarily be fully quantified. So, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. We are going to be wrapping up with just one last question here, which has to do with what are some of the immediate goals. The question was for this organization, and I'm going to answer that a couple of different ways, and then allow for others here to chime in as well. I really want to kind of point out two things. First of all, that from the ground up, as Liz mentioned earlier, is really about creating an inclusive conversation about conservation, promoting the rights of all plants, animals, and humans. So we hope that today was really an embodiment of this inclusive conversation, inviting all of you here to ask your questions. And while we weren't able to get to all of them, we will do our best to follow up with you on questions that we are able to answer. And every quarter we come out with this publication, and we look to invite more voices into this conversation. So please, if you have thoughts on anything you heard here today and you would like to submit a letter to the editors, or you have ideas for articles, we would certainly love to hear from you. We really believe that this variety of art and science and policy all coming together is really essential for widening the audience of individuals who care about the land and conservation and how it intersects with their communities and their lives. And then the other way I want to answer the question really has to do with the fact that From the Ground Up is a publication of wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities. And I'm just going to share my screen really quick because the question specifically had to do with goals and goals for Vermont. So just calling your attention to the Wildlands and Woodlands website, we have a dashboard, which hopefully you can see that. Let me just try to move that around so I can show it to you a little bit more easily, which actually outlines the different goals for all of New England and these different landscape types from wildlands, which is here in the dark green, the lighter is the woodlands, and then unconserved forests, as you see over time in these decade increments, goes from 58% down to 8%. And then we have farmland, conserved agriculture, and unconserved. And you can look at that, not just for all of New England, but at the state level as well. So I know the person who asked that question was asking about Vermont. So I will stop sharing my screen and just say thank you to everyone here. And if there's any other comments from our panelists that want to chime in, feel free to do so. And again, thanks for making time for all of us.
I would like to say something, Marissa, if that's possible.
Of course, yes, please.
A lot of what's been said today is contrary to what I believe and what I think. And for instance, I do believe that we would never have a healthy economy if we don't have a healthy land, and a healthy land has to be first. We have to look at the land as kinships, not as something that is wild. It's home. And I think a lot of the creation of agriculture, silviculture, horticulture, and all those different things that have been created by scientists have left out the cultural component. And that cultural component is critical to making land healthy and economy healthy. And I think that all needs to be considered. Somebody asked the question earlier, and it didn't get asked or repeated about do we think differently? And yes, we think differently. There's a new organization called CBIX, Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledges and Science, that just started, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're braiding together traditional ecological knowledge and Western sciences. And I think this needs to be considered in everything that we're doing in this direction. Thank you.
That was such an important contribution, Judy. So thank you so much for chiming in. All right. Well, thank you all very much. And we will be circulating the recording of this for everyone who registered, and have a wonderful day.